In 1987, Australian police were confronted by a 14-year-old girl claiming to have been starved, abused, and imprisoned by a millionaire cult leader. After raiding the property, 27 more terrified and abused children were recovered, but the millionaire cult leader had disappeared, and she would evade police for over 6 years. This is the story of the infamous Australian cult leader, Hamilton Byrne. Hi, my name is Tasha, and this is my series White Rabbit, where we deep dive into anything spooky, odd, or just interesting while I apply some special effects makeup. Before I get started, let me take a sip of tea and tell y'all about this video.
A mess.
Oh my God, this is so good. My experience with this video was like no other. Let me just say this is my 4th time recording this video.
Damn it!
There were so many different issues. Like just one example is almost the entire video, the camera was focused on this plant in the background. I don't know if it's the angle I had it set up at or because I was moving so much, because sometimes I like move around a lot and I noticed that the camera is trying like really hard to focus on me. So I don't know what it was, but basically most of the video was out of focus or trying to get in focus. So that's just one example. This is the 4th time around.
Sad sigh.
And the long form videos already take so much longer because sometimes, especially with the special effects makeup or the body paint, I do those like 3, 4, 5 times before I'm satisfied. I'm really working on becoming more consistent and getting the long form videos out faster. So just bear with me. I'm trying. This one wasn't my fault, but sometimes it is. Okay, so this is my first cult story, and it's a really long story, I think, and there's just a lot to it.
Spooky.
So I don't want to make my intro too long, but I have to update y'all on the follower count because the last video I was asking everyone to subscribe because it was my goal to make it to 200 followers. And I'm so happy to say that thanks to all of you beautiful people out there, 215. So I just wanted to take some time out and thank everybody for not only subscribing and helping me reach my goal, but for watching my videos, sharing, commenting. That is one of my favorite things, to get down in the comment section and chat back and forth with you guys about the story.
Talk to me!
So please continue to do that. And if you haven't done that, you should do that. I talk back. I'm very active in the comment section. Okay, today's makeup. Today's makeup is The Other Mother. And when you hear this story, if you do not already know this story, you're going to completely understand why I chose The Other Mother. So while I show you how I achieved this look, we are going to talk about Hamilton Byrne. Hamilton Byrne was born Evelyn Edwards on December 30th, 1921 in Sale, Australia. I'm just gonna call her Anne throughout the entire story because I don't want it to be confusing. There's already a lot of information in this one. So Anne grew up on a small farm with both of her parents and 6 siblings right outside of Melbourne. Her father, Ralph, was a very absentee parent. Like every single article I read about him, every single video I saw, they mentioned and focused in on the fact that he was never there. So it seemed like her mother, Florence, was basically left all alone to raise all 7 children by herself. Ralph would come home for just enough time to get Florence pregnant again, and then he would be gone almost immediately after that. This put so much pressure on Anne's mom. I mean, that would be pressure on anybody to raise 7 children all on your own. But Anne's mom was also a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. And she was in and out of hospitals and institutions throughout Anne's entire childhood. And Ralph leaving her all alone to be a single mother of 7 was not helping with her mental state. There was one time that Florence was so frustrated that she ran out into the middle of the street and she set herself on fire. Knowing all of this, Ralph still never came around. He made no attempts to take some of the burden off of her. He made no attempts to even build a relationship with his children. He was basically there to have sex and to leave. When Florence was being institutionalized over and over again, all of the children were put into orphanages. During one of these institution stays, unfortunately, Florence did pass away, and when that happened, the children just remained in the orphanage. Ralph never came back, never came to check on his children, never made any attempts. Okay, so jump forward to when Anne was in her early 20s. She met and married a man named Lionel, who she had her first child, Judith, with. I say first child, but technically it was her only child, even though she did accumulate many more. Spoiler. Anne and Lionel really wanted a big family, but unfortunately for them, after the birth of Judith, Anne suffered from several miscarriages. Anne had had so many miscarriages that between the two of them, they just decided that it would be better if they would adopt. Right before Anne and Lionel were going to receive their new baby, Lionel actually got into a fatal car crash. And when the adoption agency found out that Lionel passed away, they declined Anne for the adoption. Obviously, Anne was devastated by this. Who wouldn't be devastated? She lost her husband, and then she lost her baby, basically. She viewed it as her baby. It was supposed to be her baby. After these two things, both the death of her husband and her being declined by the adoption agency for the baby, these two things really created a shift in Anne. And Anne decided at this point that she was going to create a whole new identity. First, she legally changed her name from Evelyn Edwards to Anne Hamilton. And then Anne joined a yoga class, which she instantly fell in love with. Shocking. You know, cult leaders love them a good yoga class, and Anne was no different. Now, this was like the late 50s, early 60s, so yoga wasn't as widely practiced as it is now, but it was starting to gain a little traction in the mainstream. Anne loved yoga so much that she decided to become an instructor at the studio where she was taking classes. It wasn't just the yoga that Anne loved. She loved the culture and the philosophy that was attached to what she was learning. And this inspired her to start putting a more religious spin on her yoga classes. They became this blend of Christianity, Buddhism, New Age, and think. It was kind of like church, but it was still kind of yoga. It was like yurch.
Damn, I'm smart.
That is the perfect name for it. It was yurch. This blend of whatever it was that Anne was teaching, her students ate it up. Anne was a very charismatic woman. Everybody said that about her. It just seemed like when Anne started talking, she could just put everyone under her spell. Her teachings eventually became a little too much for the studio she was teaching at. They just weren't fond of the religious aspect of Anne's classes. They felt like she was too intense, things were going too far, even though the studio wanted Anne to calm down and pull back a little bit. Anne felt like she was just getting started. And this is when she decided to open up her own yoga studio / yoga school. That way she could teach whatever she wanted and nobody could say anything to her about it. When she left, she took most of her students with her. Remember, they were enamored by Anne. They were in love with her. Of course they followed. When Anne started to realize how much power she had over her students, she started to feed them little bits of information that were total lies. First, she told them that she was French royalty. Then she told them that she could talk to the dead. And then she started saying really weird, cryptic things about her being like forever youthful, forever young. Anne was laying the framework of this idea that she was of some higher power than they were. I'm just going to call them followers because at this point, let's face it, this was the infancy stages of Anne's cult. They already dipped their tippy toes into the cult pool at this point. So back to this forever youthful thing. Anne kept up this facade that she was forever youthful by getting many, and I do mean many, plastic surgeries. A lot of facelifts. I will insert some pictures for your nightmares. Here you go. Now, of course, it didn't start off that extreme. It was a little Botox here, a little facelift there. But over time, getting so many of them, That is what it became. So Anne's cult originally consisted of mostly women. That was basically the reach she had. That was the majority of people that were coming to her yoga classes. They were middle class, upper middle class women who lived in the 50s and 60s and kind of hated their husbands. Divorce was seen as this really negative thing in the 50s and 60s. So most women would rather be in a really unhappy marriage than to leave their husbands and have that stigma of being a divorcee. And seeing that these women were in this kind of vulnerable position, decided to use it to her benefit. She started to plant the seed in these women's heads that they should leave their husbands. Anne would tell these women that if they left their husbands, they could come live with her and they would be this one big happy family. And little by little, time after time, these women started to serve their husbands with divorce papers. And then they showed up to Anne. And just like she said, Anne welcomed them with open arms. Of course she did. She's a cult leader. In 1961, Anne met a very important person in today's story. His name was Dr. Rainer Johnson. Dr. Johnson was an extremely intelligent man. He had a PhD in physics, and he was also a leading researcher in spectroscopy. The easiest way that I can understand that is that he was studying the relationship between light and matter. And Dr. Johnson was very well respected in his community as well as in his field. The thing about Dr. Johnson was, even though he was a man of science, he was also a man of mysticism. He was very interested in spirituality, in the afterlife, anything occult he was into. Dr. Johnson became enamored with Anne after they met. He was looking for a spiritual advisor, and she was looking for more men to join her cult. Anne knew that her power and her reach would only go so far with all women. Remember, this was the 1960s. So she wanted to get some heavy hitters into her cult, and she felt like they needed to be men. Anne knew that Dr. Johnson was looking for a spiritual leader, and between his intelligence, his interest in mysticism, and his power, he was like the perfect person to join her cult. At the time, they were called the Great White Brotherhood, which should tell you everything you need to know about this little cult, but they would later change their name to the Family. After about 6 months, Dr. Johnson had his official initiation. As a part of this ritualistic practice, he and Anne took lots and lots of LSD together, dropping tons of acid. And during one of these acid trips, Anne comes to this realization. Anne comes to the realization that she is actually the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and Dr. Johnson is actually John the Baptist. Dr. Johnson was like completely under her spell by this time. So he's like, yeah, okay, I believe you. He was under her spell so much so that he actually began recruiting for her. He would talk to his high society, high power political friends about this spiritual guru that he met, how she was the real deal and how she was performing all of these miracles. He would suggest Anne's yoga class to them, and because he was such a respected person, they would go. Now, once they would attend a class, it would be very obvious that this wasn't just a regular yoga class. This was Yurge. This is a little bit of yoga and a lot of bit of Anne preaching about being Christ. But because Anne is so charismatic that when they heard her preach, they would stay. It created this domino effect where the more doctors and officials and high-powered people joined the cult, the more legit the cult seemed. And the more legit the cult seemed, the more it became easier to recruit other individuals that were also high-power, high-standing community members. With the help of Dr. Johnson, Anne ended up recruiting 2 psychiatrists that worked at a local hospital. The hospital at the time was called New Haven Lunatic Asylum. We're just going to call it New Haven. So Anne recruited those 2 psychiatrists, and then the owner of New Haven was also a member of Anne's cult. He fell under her spell just like everyone else. So one way that Anne was able to lure so many people in was with drugs. Anne told every new initiate that they would need to take LSD so that they could become more open to having a spiritual experience with her. They would be pumped with LSD and then placed in this dark, dark room for days. During this time, Anne would show up in all white with a freaking smoke machine. Mind you, they are sky high. Anne would show up with her smoke machine and then she would start whispering these insane things into their ears about being Christ and about following her and about worshiping her. And this method honestly worked for her. Once they were in the cult, then Anne would actively work to start breaking up and separating the family units. Anne would mix and match husbands and wives, and she would decide who can have children with who. Now, I am sure I would have been long gone by now, but if not, this would be the thing to get me to leave. Can you imagine someone telling you that your husband or your wife has to have a child with some other random person? It's nothing but a mind manipulation and a power thing that she's doing. It's not that original. But once again, it was working for her. Now, Anne was doing pretty good at this point. The cult was growing and she wanted to start investing in properties. Anne bought her first of many properties in 1968. She would have these wealthy men in her cult pull together and buy properties and then transfer them into her company's name. They were fools because no way. I would have gotten kicked out, excommunicated from the cult before I buy you a property. This property we are going to call the Lodge because I cannot pronounce the first part of the name. So the Lodge was where Anne and her followers would get together and have these really important meetings, which basically the meetings were just, once again, Anne preaching about how she was Jesus while everyone was completely plastered from the LSD. They would all trip together and Anne would continue to ingrain these things into their brains. She was brainwashing them while they were under LSD influence. Anne was so wealthy at this point, she was requiring her followers to give her 10% of everything that they earned. Anne was a millionaire off of all of these people's hard work. Remember, these were politicians, lawyers, government officials. All of these people were giving her 10% of what they made. She did still have her original group of followers that were from that yoga class, the middle-aged women that hated their husbands. But by this time, she had a lot of wealthy people that were in the cult. Wealthy enough to buy her properties in the United States, in the UK, in Australia. That same year, Anne met a man named Bill Byrne. Now, Bill was very married when he and Anne met, but like everyone else, once he met Anne, he became enamored. Enamored to the fact where he left his wife and kids. He moved in with Anne and they just started their new life together. They were in love and he got married to who he thought was Jesus. You know, I kind of find that odd that he didn't find that odd. Like, do you really think if Jesus came back, he would be messing with married men and taking LSD? But Bill thought this is exactly what Jesus would do, and so he was all for it. Really, Bill? Really, Bill? He knew she wasn't Jesus. The cult really began to take off after this. They were up to about 500 members. And all of these members started buying homes in the same little community. So it's like once you entered a certain part of town, that was like Cultsville. All of the cult members lived there.
We're not a cult.
This was around the time where the cult officially became known as the family. After Anne expanded her family and married Bill, she wanted to expand the family in another way. Anne wanted children, and Anne wanted a lot of children. And the reason Anne wanted children is because she wanted to develop this master race. Yep. Another one of those. So this master race, because this was a doomsday cult. I don't know if I said that, but this was a doomsday cult. And so this master race was going to be the race that survived the extinction of everyone else. And they would have to repopulate the earth. So they needed to be the best of the best. Now remember, Anne can't have children. But what Anne does have is she has connections to New Haven. Remember New Haven, the psychiatrist, the owners? Yeah, Anne is in tight at New Haven. It had grown to the point where it seemed like Almost everyone that worked at New Haven was a part of Anne's cult. I mean, doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, the social workers, all a part of the family. Anne had her little gnarled claws into every nook and cranny of that hospital. So Anne instructed her evil little workers at New Haven to start stealing babies. The mothers at New Haven were very vulnerable. They were normally really young, unwed, single mothers that were there for psychiatric help. The staff at New Haven had so many different ways of stealing these babies. One of them involved pumping these new mothers full of drugs until they were so incoherent that they didn't know what they were doing, and then they would have them sign over their rights. Other times they would claim that someone was unfit to be a mother and they would simply take their children away. They would even place a pillow in between the mother and like the rest of her body when she gave birth so that she never got the opportunity to see her baby, and the baby would just be taken right out. And aside from the whole stealing baby thing, Anne had members of her cult having children just to hand them over to her. These people were thinking that Jesus wants them to have a child. I don't think they felt like they could tell Jesus no. Anne had also weaseled her way into the brains of doctors and nurses that worked at other hospitals, and they would keep an eye out for mothers that fit the description of what Anne wanted, like her perfect victim. They had this operation running so smoothly that before these women could even heal up from birthing a child, they were being led to believe that they already gave that baby up and that there was nothing that they could do about it. Anne also had a group of lawyers that falsified documents for her. Things like birth records, birth certificates, so that if they were ever found or if they were ever questioned, they could supply this paperwork to prove that this was a legal adoption. Once these children became a part of the family, if their hair was not an acceptable color, it was dyed this platinum blonde. Anne wanted it to appear as if she was actually all of these children's mothers, so only certain types of hair colors were allowed. Ones that kind of made sense, nothing too dark. Remember, she's creating this master race. So if the color was too dark, it had to be lightened and they had to get regular touch-ups. Doesn't matter how young. There were a total of 28 children in the family that all thought that Anne was their mother. Anne only had one, but all of these children were raised as siblings. They did not know anything different. Even people in the cult, other than the specific people that Anne had helping her actually steal babies, other people in the cult thought that those were Anne's children. Anne would always wear this baby bump pretending to be pregnant, and one of the cult members was quoted as saying that Anne was always pregnant. Little twins here, triplets there. And it makes sense that Anne was having to pretend to have so many multiples because she accumulated like 28 children over 10 years. To me, that seems kind of impossible, but to the cult, they were like, yeah, Jesus can obviously do that. As the children started to grow, Anne ended up opening up a school because obviously the kids could not interact with outsiders. In order for them to be properly brainwashed, they had to be taught by cult members. The children were imprisoned in one of Anne's properties located, like it was hidden away in the woods, and this property was called Uptop. The whole purpose of Uptop was to hide the children. There was barbed wire fence surrounding the entire property, not just to keep others out, but to also keep the children in. The children of Uptop were mostly raised by aunties and uncles who were just designated cult members. The whole auntie-uncle thing gives me the Handmaid's Tale vibes, and that's terrifying. The worst belief that the cult had, in my opinion, was that in order for children to get closer to God, they had to suffer. So not only were the auntie and uncles not allowed to intervene in any type of suffering that the children were going through, but they were also there to inflict suffering upon them so that the children could be as close to God as possible. And Anne apparently loved this. There were even reports of her being out of town and calling in to have the aunties and uncles punish children, and she would have them hold the phone close so that she could hear the cries. How sadistic is that? The children of up top were extremely malnourished. They were starved not only as punishment if they misbehaved, they were starved in general because Anne had certain weight requirements for each child and they were not allowed to go over. Like, Anne was literally so dumb. She didn't even take into account that these children are growing. Maybe their bodies are catching up because they're getting taller. No, Anne would hear none of that. They were not allowed to go over the designated weight. If a child did not meet their weight goals, Anne would have the aunties and uncles starve that child for weeks to the brink of death. The children were starved to the point of stealing bird seed to eat. The aunties and uncles also would be instructed to perform water torture on the children. They would take the child being punished to this specific bucket that they had outside, and they would hold their head under the water until they almost drown, and then repeat. The most severe punishments were always reserved for the bedwetters. Anne hated bedwetters. The aunties, the uncles, they hated bedwetters. Bedwetting is a sign of trauma. Maybe if you weren't sadistically punishing all these children, you wouldn't have bedwetters, Anne. And what I hate about Anne is that she will do all of these things, but pretend that she loves the children so much. She would have them get dressed in these frilly white outfits and go do yoga in the fucking fields, and she would record them for the sole purpose of recruiting others into her cult. Like, look how beautiful my children are. Look at them frolicking in the fields. Look at their perfect weight and their petite size. How could you be building a master race with malnourished kids? I just thought about that. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So Anne would show videos of them doing yoga. Meanwhile, they're dying at up top. These children were beaten, starved, and sick. There was no access to any medical facilities at up top. Anything that happened to them there, they had to deal with there. And up top didn't even have running water or electricity. Now, on top of being starved, the children of up top at around the age of 8 or 9 started to be drugged just like the other cult members. I read a couple of different accounts on how the children were drugged, so I'm not 100% sure. But from my research, this is what I think happened. So starting at the age of 8 or 9, the children would be drugged with Valium. By the time they got to 14 or 15, they are transitioned over to LSD, just like the rest of the cult. And I believe the children were drugged twice daily. So I hopped on Google and I looked up the side effects of both of these, Valium and LSD, because the children had like a really rigorous schedule. It was so intense. They had to wake up at like 5 a.m., do hours of yoga before hours of chores, and then they were given the bare minimum food. We're going to start with the side effects of Valium. Confusion, sleepiness, agitation, dizziness, blurred vision, constipation, dark urine, decreased urine, depression, irritability, muscle weakness, anxiety, nausea, chills. Okay, so that's Valium. Okay, so now the side effects of LSD. Hallucinations greatly reduce perception of reality. For example, interpreting input from one of your senses as another, such as hearing colors. Rapid shifts in emotion, permanent mental changes in perception, rapid heart rate, increased blood pressure, and tremors. Now it's obvious to me that the aunties and the uncles, as well as Anne, know that with all of these side effects, it is not possible for these children to be these perfect children that they wanted them to be. But remember, they think that in order for them to get closer to God, closer to Anne, they have to suffer. They're waking up at 5 a.m. doing yoga. They're doing all of this and the babies are hearing colors. I don't know how they got anything done, honestly. Now, remember I said by the age of 14 or 15, the children would be transitioned over to LSD? Well, they would go through the same initiation process as the rest of the cult. They would be pumped full of LSD, thrown into a dark room. A few days later, in comes Anne with her smoke machine and ridiculousness, whispering all of these crazy things into their ears. And while everyone was tripping on LSD, the aunties and uncles would be whispering in their ears about how evil and dangerous the outside world is and how they should never go there. Remember, they were a doomsday cult. They thought everything outside of the family was evil and they wanted to get to heaven, and the only way they could get to heaven was through Anne. So you did not want to get on Anne's bad side. That was Jesus. And you know, for the outside to have been such this evil, terrible place, Anne sure spent most of her time there. She was a multi-millionaire at this point, still collecting that 10% from all of her wealthy followers. And Anne liked to live that life of luxury. She was a world traveler. She vacationed. She had the best of clothes, the best cars. She was eating the most magnificent meals, and the children up top were eating grass. Unfortunately for Anne, the neighbors surrounding up top started to get really suspicious. They were curious as to what was going on with the children. The children, for the most part, were so rarely seen, and when they were seen, it was concerning. So members of the community got together and they started to pressure the police to go do a welfare check, stating that there was possibly abuse going on at up top, and the neighbors wanted to make sure that the children were okay. The children were a little strange, and they were, but it was to no fault of their own. They had no contact with outsiders. Not only that, they weren't allowed to bond with each other inside of the cult. So it's easy to understand why they would seem strange to everyone else. The neighbors were also looking at Anne, and they were looking at the children, and the neighbors were like, those are not your kids. They did not believe that these were Anne's children. And to be fair, they weren't. The neighbors suspected that there might be some child abuse. But the police basically responded by saying, we are not social services. Do not call us unless you know there is a crime. That's unfortunate for the children of up top. The police did end up getting involved when a 10-year-old girl went missing, and the community started to blame the family. Now, Anne did not kidnap this girl. This is one of the stories. Allegedly, her mother was in the cult and gave her daughter to Anne. When the little girl's father found out, he lost it, rightfully so, and he went to the police. Now, even though Anne was cleared of all wrongdoing, basically hell broke loose. This brought so much attention, unwanted attention, to the cult. Reporters started showing up at up top and at the lodge, pestering Anne and the aunties and uncles about where the children were and why they were being hidden. And this was definitely spooking Anne because she knew what she was doing to those children and she did not want to get caught. Eventually, police do end up showing up at up top to do a welfare check on the children. During this welfare check, all of the children were hidden in this secret closet-like bunker room, and they were terrified. Remember, they think outsiders are evil and trying to kill them. So the whole time this welfare check was being performed, the children were silent in this bunker. And I, for one, did not understand that because I thought when you do a welfare check, you have to physically see the person or people you're checking on. The police looked around and then they just left. Clearly, they did not put a lot of effort or energy into the search because those children lived in filthy, disgusting, horrendous conditions. You only need eyes to be able to see that they shouldn't be here. Although the police were doing nothing, the media was nonstop hounding the family. To make matters worse, the children were becoming teenagers and they were starting to rebel. They had enough. The two oldest girls, Sarah and Leanne, were really the ones that were giving Anne and the aunties and uncles a run for their money. They started breaking out of the compound at night, and then they were breaking into people's homes to steal food and bring back to their brothers and sisters. And then when they would come back, they would tell the other children about the outside world and what it was really like. They had made a few friends, and basically Sarah and Leanne were coming to the realization that Anne was a liar. The outside world was nothing like she told them it was. This sparked such a rebellion, especially in Sarah. When Sarah was punished, she did not give a damn. Not only was she not gonna cry, but that very same night, she would sneak out again and bring more food back to the compound. During this time, Anne almost never came back to the compound. She was spending most of her time in her New York property just so that she could avoid the Australian press. Anne basically told the aunties, y'all handle my light work. I am Jesus. I don't have time for this. But after Anne found out what Sarah and Leanne was doing, she was livid. Anne could tell that she lost her grip over Sarah, and she responded by kicking her out of the family. She told Sarah, "You are no longer my daughter. You can die out there." Once again, I'm Jesus. I don't have to put up with this. You're supposed to be following me, and you're not doing any of the things I told you to do. Sarah clearly did not want to be there anyway. I mean, she was breaking out of the compound at night. So she went back and she packed her belongings, and Leanne packed them too. The two girls left the family, and Sarah ended up going to the police to report all of these psychos. The police were said to be in disbelief. I don't know how. So many people called. So many people reported them. But anyway, this time they responded with a raid of up top. The children were terrified, and they were literally throwing hands with the police officers. They thought they were there to murder them. But eventually, luckily, all of the children were rescued safely, and all of the aunties and uncles at up top were arrested. Following that, all of Anne's Australian properties were raided, and they retrieved a ton of evidence. They took meticulous notes about all of their illegal activities, which I'm sure by this point they were regretting. A massive stash of LSD was recovered. That New Haven hospital that was full of Anne's little cult members, yeah, they shut that down. And at that point, all of the remaining aunties and uncles at all different properties, they all started to flee. Because people were going to jail and being charged with very serious crimes, and Anne, little Miss Jesus, was not breaking them out of jail, and they didn't understand why. Some of the doctors lost their licenses to practice, and others, like Dr. Johnson, you remember him, they were completely destroyed in the media. This reputation that he worked so hard to build up for so many years, he was basically seen as a fool for his involvement with the family. After all of this, all of her crimes, all of the torture of the children, Anne and her husband were sentenced to a combined $5,000 fine. They are multi-millionaires, and they were only fined $5,000 for their involvement. Supposedly, Anne had friends in high places, and I believe it because she did horrific things and she completely got away with it. There was no justice served to those children. She went right back to being a cult leader. Anne Hamilton Byrne lived a very long, full life. She died at the age of 97, a very wealthy cult leader, and she left her millions to her remaining cult members, and they are still active today. Let me know in the comments how you think Anne was able to legally get off with only a $5,000 fine. That was so surprising to me. I mean, even with her having friends in high places, this was a very, very public trial. Leave your thoughts below, and remember to like this video on your way out if you like this video, and if you want to see more like it, subscribe if you haven't. My next goal is 500, and I would love to see you down another rabbit hole.